Welcome to the session of Global History and International Law seminar series on the making of international law in the Global South. To start us off, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Samuel Foley Childs Daly, Assistant Professor of African and American Studies at Duke University, Professor Dr. Eliseo Makamo, sociologist and member of the Center of African Studies at the University of Basel, and Dr. Lasse Hertin, historian at Ruhr University Bochum. Dr. Samuel Foley Childs Daly is a historian of 20th century Africa, whose research career has spanned from West to East Africa, from legal, military to social historical approaches to the study of the past. His book, forthcoming in July at Cambridge University Press, A History of the Republic of Biafra, Law, Crimes, and the Nigerian Civil War, draws a connection between the crisis conditions of the war and the forms of crime that came to be associated with Nigeria in its wake. Daly's new next project, is a transnational history of a military desertion in Africa over the longue durée. Sociologist Eliseo Makamo is tenure-track assistant professor of African Studies at the University of Basel and a research fellow at the Universitário de Lisboa in Portugal. Previously, he was a postdoc fellow at the University of Beirut, an Agora fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Berlin, and also a visiting lecturer at Eduardo Mondlane University in Mozambique. He was also a founding member of the Beirut International Graduate School of African Studies. Dr. Lasse Hertin is a transnational and global historian of modern Europe and the world. His first book, published by 2017 at Cambridge University Press, analyzes how the Nigerian Civil War, a third world conflict that had initially been of marginal international interest, became a global media and protest event when the humanitarian crisis in Biafra aroused concern about publics around the globe. In his current research, he uses the port of Hamburg for an entangled but locally focused analysis of globalization and urbanization in the age of imperial expansion. The Republic of Biafra lasted for less than 3 years, but the war over its secession would contort Nigeria for decades to come. Wartime Biafra was glutted with firearms, rocked by famine, and administered by a government that buckled under the weight of the conflict. In these dangerous conditions, many people survived by engaging in fraud, extortion, and armed violence. When the fighting ended in 1970, these survival tactics endured, even so Biafra itself disappeared from the map. But how did the court reflect on the history of the Nigerian Civil War and its aftermath? How did people navigate conditions of extreme hardship on the war front? How did the conditions of the Nigerian Civil War pave the way for the country's long experience of crime that was to follow? How did technology, survival practices, and moral ideologies that emerge in the context of the fighting shape the practice and perception of crime after defeat? Dr. Daly is going to answer these questions. The commentary will be provided first by sociologist Eliseo Makamo and then by Dr. Lasse Hertin. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Schofields, for having me here. It was a very nice surprise to get this invitation because this is actually the first book talk that I will be doing. So thank you for the opportunity. And a special thank you to Professor Dr. Makamo and Dr. Hertin for serving as discussants, especially at what I understand was short notice, so thank you. So today I'll be speaking about my forthcoming book, which is entitled A History of the Republic of Biafra, Law, Crime, and the Nigerian Civil War. And it will be appearing next month from Cambridge University Press. And as Dr. Schofields described, The book is about the Nigerian Civil War, which took place from 1967 to 1970, and which many of you may be familiar with. But the book takes a kind of unusual tack to the history of this war. And in particular, it's about the relationship between the story of the war and a larger story about the proliferation of crime in post-colonial Nigeria. And this is a history that emerges from a legal archive from the secessionist Republic of Biafra. And this legal archive, consisting of fairly ordinary court cases, is piecemeal and scattered, and it's also very profoundly endangered. But these cases from Biafra's courts are valuable because they provide an entree into a history of the war from within Biafra itself, from behind the Biafran lines. And this is actually a kind of important intervention in the historiography of a war that has been made largely about its international dimensions rather than its domestic reverberations. These cases, I think, are also important because they give us a way of understanding, in a broader sense, beyond the particularities of this conflict, the relationship between warfare, violence, and crime, not only in post-colonial Africa, but more generally. And ultimately, it is that relationship and that question about how warfare paves the way for crime that most animates my work, both in this book and more broadly. So, to those who may not be familiar with the story of the Nigerian Civil War, the war began with the secession of the eastern region of Nigeria as the Republic of Biafra in May of 1967. And Biafra seceded in the name of protecting the lives and interests of Igbos, a ethnic group that called the eastern region home. And this secession came in the aftermath of a series of pogroms against them in 1966 in northern Nigeria. Nigeria was not willing to simply let its eastern region go its separate ways, you might imagine. Africa's largest country would simply shatter into pieces if this happened. And so Nigeria began a police action, or what it called a police action, to reclaim its errant eastern province, and this quickly escalated into a full-fledged war. Biafra was blockaded by Nigeria and subjected to heavy bombardment. And this situation created a humanitarian crisis there that stunned the outside world and that Biafra began to call genocidal. And it is this dimension of the war that is the topic of Professor Hirton's book, which I recommend to those who are interested. It's an excellent book. Everyday life in Biafra was extremely precarious in these circumstances of hunger and starvation, bombardment, and also internal threats to liberty that were largely the creation of the Biafran government itself. Things like press ganging were increasingly common features of life in Biafra. And Biafra became a kind of watchword for suffering worldwide. This situation continued and really became worse as the war went on until Biafra finally surrendered in January of 1970. But by this point, the human cost of the war had become enormous. Just what exactly that cost is a subject of great contention. Credible estimates for the number of casualties range from 1 to 3 million, and it's really hard for me to give a figure that is more precise than that. At any rate, it was an enormous loss of life, and the great majority of it was on the Biafran side. After the war ended, the former Republic of Biafra was reintegrated into Nigeria through a contentious and very drawn-out process. This reintegration process was successful in at least one respect, though, which is that the question of Biafra's independence was not seriously raised in Nigeria for the next 50 years. Although just in the last couple of years that has begun to change, and Biafra is now part of Nigerian politics, contemporary Nigerian politics, today in a way that it really hasn't been in the recent past. So many recent works about Biafra have recounted the story of the Civil War as one of extroversion, as a chapter in the history of international humanitarianism, or the legal treatment of the question of genocide in the international community, or as an episode in the Cold War. And it is all of those things, to be sure, But my focus is on one of the war's internal legacies, one that is, I think, often elided in these international approaches, and that is its connection to the practice of crime. I argue that the pressures of the war and the kinds of circumstances that were created by mass hunger and state entropy in Biafra made a space for new and alarming types of crime to flourish there, especially fraud and also armed crime, which in many cases were also survival tactics. Fraud in particular was a way of dealing with risk, which makes Professor Makamo a particularly appropriate interlocutor, I think, for this book. The categories of crime that thrived in Biafra and that made up the bulk of the Biafran court's caseloads included things like forgery, armed robbery, and also the category of fraudulent activities that is collectively known as 419 in Nigeria, after the section of both the Biafran and the Nigerian criminal codes that prohibited it. You may be familiar with 419 today as a form of advanced fee fraud that usually takes place over email. Well, I argue that this form of fraud that is so closely associated in most of our imaginations with the internet actually has a longer genealogy, and it is connected in very meaningful ways to what happened on and around the Biafran battlefield, and also in the aftermath of the Nigerian Civil War. It's not coincidental that these particular kinds of crime and misconduct, which were so present in Biafra, became the scourge of post-war Nigeria in the 1970s and 80s. After the war, these practices of crime spread, and they metastasized beyond the boundaries of the former Republic of Biafra into the rest of reintegrated Nigeria. And it was this suite of interrelated criminal activities that largely gave Nigeria the global reputation for fraud and malfeasance that the country is still, to this day, trying to shake off. So my book, in a broad sense, tells the story of how this came to pass. So the very fact that Biafra had courts and a functional legal system at all may come as some surprise, given that the dominant image of this war is famously that of a starving child and not a well-ordered courtroom. But Biafra very much did have courts and a legal system, and in fact, in some respects, it actually had little else besides that. So the cover image of the book, which I would share with you, but I'm not adept at Zoom enough to figure out how to do that. So just think back to the cover that Professor Schopfels showed you. That cover shows Biafra's Chief Justice, whose name was Sir Louis Mbanefo, a legal intellectual personality of worldwide renown in his day, and also the Chief Justice of Biafra, swearing in Chukwuemeka Odumegwu Ojukwu as head of state, both of them in full regalia. And in fact, I think this image and others like it suggests that law was extremely important in Biafra. And the legal system was at the center of the country's political and administrative culture. And it was also at the center of its national ethos and its ideology, as a place that had been born of a Nigeria that Biafra's propagandists claimed was lawless and anarchic and had allowed the pogroms of 1966 to happen. Incidentally, many of those propagandists were some of the most sort of eminent African intellectuals of their day, and they included people like Chinua Achebe, the novelist, and Cyprian Akwensi, the folklorist and novelist. So law in these circumstances became something much more than just a mechanism for the resolution of disputes or the provision of justice in some abstract sense. It was also increasingly the only functional part of the Biafran state apparatus. And in the final stages of the war, Biafra became a funny kind of state in that effectively it consisted of a court system with an army attached to it. And I won't go into this in detail now, but I think this fact forces us to reconsider what we consider, how we consider the African nation state as a typology, but also has a lesson for the nation state as a more general form. But to go back to the particulars of this historical episode, as I mentioned, so the situation in Biafra deteriorated over the course of the war. And towards the end of the conflict, trials were held in the shells of bombed out buildings or under the shade of trees. Proceedings were recorded by hand on pieces of scrap paper. And to read these very grim narratives about wartime acts of crime or survivalism that are recorded in a child's exercise book or on the back of a love letter, as one criminal case was, is very affecting. And I think this is an illustration of the fact that the materiality of an archive can sometimes say as much as the words that are recorded within it. So there is a larger methodological claim that is made in the book as well about the nature of archives in post-colonial Africa and how we might read their apparent thinness as evidence about the nature of post-colonial states and societies. I should note also that there is an oral historical component to the project, and I did a lot of interviews with people who had served as lawyers or magistrates in Biafra. And so a small part of the project is a kind of legal ethnography of the profession in Nigeria and Biafra in this period. So few historians have analyzed the inner workings of the Biafran state itself. And I think this is because there's a general consensus, even among people who participated in the Biafran cause or who supported it heart and soul, that their government was not quite a real government, that it was a facade or a mimicry of what a real state ought to look like. And there is some truth to this idea. Biafra often comes across as fleeting or evanescent, even in its own state records. But the cases that I want to share with you today and that form the backbone of the research for this book resulted in real decisions by highly trained and in some cases internationally known judges. And these were decisions that dissolved marriages and changed the boundaries of property and sent people to the gallows. So if this legal system was a facade, it was at any rate a very convincing one. There is a larger argument here about proceduralism. African law is often presumed to be too weak or unruly or derivative to establish standards, to maintain order, to define the rights and duties of citizens. And the fact that law can have this kind of force, even somewhere as seemingly inchoate as Biafra, suggests to me that African legal systems, including ones that operate in less extreme circumstances, are more systematic and more instrumental than they have been given credit for, especially by legal academics. Legal procedure played a very important role in public administration in this setting, and soldiers and civilians clung to legal institutions even as the war disrupted life around them. So Biafra is important not because it was chaotic, but because it was more orderly than I think anyone has really appreciated. Okay, so I now want to describe a couple of these cases with you in more detail. And the one that I'll start out with is the 1969 case against a young man named Arnold Akpan. So towards the end of the war, Arnold Akpan found his calling in life, and it was as a forger. Akpan was about 16 years old. He had been a secondary school student whose studies had been interrupted by the war. He lived near a town called Udi, and he lived alone, his parents having disappeared earlier in the war. He had deserted from the Biafran army once already, and he was terrified of being conscripted once again. So he wrote up a pass for himself saying that he was ineligible for conscription as a kind of qualified technician, basically. And he realized in short order that this was a valuable skill, and he began making and selling passes to other young men who were also hoping to avoid being conscripted. One day he was searched at a checkpoint on the road, and the forged documents that he was bringing to sell to someone were discovered. He tried to swallow them, but failed, and the partially chewed papers were presented as evidence against him in a subsequent trial before the Special Tribunal of Biafra, which was a kind of military tribunal set up with jurisdiction over civilians as well, part of the larger apparatus of martial law. He was found guilty of subversion of the Biafran state and was given a long prison sentence. I don't know what happened to Akpan after this episode. He disappears from the legal record. However, 18 years later, long after Biafra has been defeated and reintegrated into Nigeria, Akpan makes another appearance in the record, this time having been arrested once again in the city of Onitsha for the crime of forging school certificates. So I don't know what Akpan was up to in the 18 years that passed between these two arrests, but his life story, or at least what I can confirm of it, from these events, suggests or gives credence to something that many legal practitioners knew to be true anecdotally, which is that skills that people developed to survive the war often long outlasted the war itself. Biafran courts heard hundreds of cases about forgery and 419, even as the war raged all around them. Some of this fraud was opportunistic. There were people who used the war as a chance to remake themselves in various ways, often through deception or forgery. But the majority of it, at least in my reading, was fundamentally about survival. Passes in particular were a necessity for traders and refugees and anyone hoping to avoid conscription or harassment in Biafra. But as the Biafran government atrophied over the course of the war, there was increasingly no official way to actually obtain these documents. And so a lot of people simply made their own. Biafrans of all classes and backgrounds, rich and poor, soldier and civilian, men and women, found that carrying documents of almost any provenance was essential to their survival. So fraud and forgery boomed as a result, and the difference between real and counterfeit eroded precipitously. And in post-war Nigeria, this muddled line between the real and the fake would have major implications for the practice of crime. To share another case with you, the demands of the war effort created many different kinds of gray areas, not only in law, but also in kind of public morality. And the imperatives of the fight against Nigeria made certain things permissible or excusable that they would not have been in peacetime. Forgery could even serve the Biafran cause in some circumstances. So in one case, Oscar Oti and two others versus the state, the Biafran Court of Appeal entirely acquitted 3 men who had been arrested prior to Biafra secession for possessing paper, ink, and printer's plates, all of which they needed to forge Nigerian currency, which was a clear violation of the law. But the decision to acquit them on appeal in Biafra was made on the rather dubious grounds that it was not illegal to possess these materials, because to forge specifically Nigerian banknotes was not specified as a crime in the eastern region of Nigeria's criminal code, which was still in force in Biafra, presumably because that wording would have just been taken for granted. So they were acquitted at the urging of the Senior State Council of Biafra, and this is a decision that seems to me to have been calculated to give oblique legal sanction to forgery, as long as it was Nigerian currency being forged, because forging the currency of the enemy served the cause of independence, right? So this case, I think, illustrates a larger important point that is germane far beyond the particularities of this conflict, which is that certain behaviors that are permissible and even encouraged during wartime as survival tactics or indeed as patriotic duties are usually impermissible or even downright criminal in times of peace. So I want to note that there was also something else that Biafran judges were doing in their legal work, and that was articulating some idea of who constituted the Biafran public and why Biafra deserved to exist apart from Nigeria, even though judges didn't necessarily agree on what the boundaries of that public ought to be or what content this new nationality ought to have. And this process of defining the nation was intimately tied to questions about crime and criminal law as well, which to any legal historians in the room probably know is often treated as a kind of backwater of law, but in Biafra was actually a main channel of state power. And it served this important function because Biafra defined itself against, like I said, this lawless and anarchic Nigeria that had allowed the pogroms of 1966 to happen. And so the obsession with good behavior and law and order was deeply embedded in Biafra's ideology and its sense of itself. Judges used law to define the contours of this new citizenship in a number of different ways, including in how they treated matters of jurisdiction, how they treated matters of customary law, which was closely tied to ideas about nation and community, and also through legal ritual and poetics, how they phrased boilerplate, what they did in the courtroom, what they accepted as a legitimate oath, that kind of thing. So, as I said, the war would end in 1970 with Biafra's defeat. And the question of how the war shaped Nigeria after the fighting had stopped is ultimately, I think, a larger and probably more important one than understanding how Biafra worked during its brief period of existence. And to answer that larger question requires analyzing how the idea of Biafra was liquidated in the post-war period, and how ex-Biafrans turned the skills that they had developed to survive the war to surviving the peace, a peace that unfolded in a shattered, deeply impoverished Eastern Nigeria, where the state had little interest in tamping down on violent crime, which was a major problem, but also took a heavy-handed approach to politics and used criminal law as a tool to police dissent and to ensure that Biafra didn't try to secede again. So in these lean and difficult years, the techniques that former Biafrans had used to survive the war were sometimes turned to more explicitly criminal endeavors. As one lawyer who made his career in the 1970s in Port Harcourt recalled, after the war, quote, "No one forgot how to shoot a gun or how to forge a document." Forgery, embezzlement, scams, impersonation, all of these things that would become major problems in Nigeria from the 1970s onwards had existed long before the war. They certainly were not invented during this period. But the war embedded them in the experience of ordinary people in new ways. And once they were there, it would prove very difficult to dislodge them from Nigerian social, political, and commercial life in the decades that followed. It's important, I think, to understand that the emergence of endemic fraud in post-war Nigeria was a consequence of the conditions of war, rather than something that was inherent to the Nigerian or Biafran character as it was often portrayed at the time. Warfare often involves double crossings and the production and exchange of forged documents and the assumption of false identities. And all of these things are more or less normal behaviors when espionage and survivalism and winning the war are the order of the day. In certain circumstances, those things might even be seen as patriotic duties, like I said. But what happens when those behaviors don't cease with the end of the fighting? If these practices continue in peacetime, they tend to be called fraud rather than patriotism or getting by. There is a similar story to be told here about armed crime, which I haven't talked about today, but figures very prominently in the book. Although in the heat of battle, a soldier might use his weapon to legitimately requisition property from civilians in some circumstances, if he goes back and does that once the war is over, most courts would quite reasonably consider that to be theft rather than a requisitioning. And when the line between those things blurs, what results is something like a crime wave, or what appears to be a crime wave. Surplus arms from the war circulated in Nigeria for decades after the end of the war in 1970, and this kind of lubricated to what to many people looked like a first nationwide and then actually region-wide crime wave. So to wrap up, because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, a large part of my objective in this project is to show how the specific particular structural conditions of the Nigerian Civil War made a space for criminality and violence, and to show how that happened in a fairly granular and specific way, which works against larger and more totalizing theories of violence and governance in post-colonial Africa. Many observers treat the existence of crime and criminality and certain patterns of what is often understood as disorder, which became a kind of watchword of African politics in the era of military rule, as if it somehow appeared spontaneously and mysteriously. Or alternatively, as if a predilection for crime was always already there in Nigeria and merely became visible after the end of colonial rule. There is also an interpretation which says that crime took off as a kind of mechanical consequence of structural adjustment and the attendant withering of the African state. Or alternatively, there is an explanation which says that it only really emerged or became a problem after the transition to democratic rule in 1999, implying that there is a kind of sliding scale between democratic freedom and everyday security. I find all of these explanations unsatisfying, among other reasons because they all suggest in one way or another that it is only the threat of state power that keeps people from stealing from one another or defrauding one another in times of peace. Fraud and forgery, together with armed violence, went from being techniques of survival to parts of Nigeria's criminal and political ecology, and they became normalized over the short course of this period. There was nothing inherent about crime in post-colonial Nigeria, and the emergence of 419 and other ancillary forms of crime was the result of identifiable historical processes, and ones that are not found only in Africa. Okay, so I will leave it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks so much for this presentation. So, Professor Makamu, yeah, the floor is yours. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation on very short notice. But thank you also for sending me the 2 chapters, which I had the pleasure of reading yesterday. And I want to thank Samuel for a very exciting project. I think I will want to read the whole book. It's written in such a clear and really informative way. You know, it's the kind of history book that you know, one would always like to read. It's really a great story that you are telling in that book. I am not a historian myself, so the comments that I'm going to make to your book are not the comments of a historian. They're the comments of a sociologist. But of course, there is a deep relationship of complicity between history and sociology, especially because sociology, you know, cannot do its job without historical background. You know, the things that we want to account for always have a history. So history is very important as the background to whatever we want to do. Now, what I understand from what I read and from this brilliant and very clear presentation you've just made is that, and you repeated that here, I think, that you actually have 2 stories that you want to tell us. So one story is the story of the relationship between warfare and crime. And the other story is the story of, well, relationship between the post-colonial state and legal order or the rule of law. And both of these stories are very, very important, of course, within the context of African studies. But they are also very compelling stories that you are telling. You know, I don't know how to frame this. I find the stories compelling. I need to read the whole book to be able to say whether I find them convincing, right? But I really find them compelling. So let me start with the first one, the relationship between warfare and crime. I think this makes a lot of sense, what you are saying. I mean, especially the idea that you spelled out very clearly here, that where you have a context within which people need to survive, people will resort to certain strategies, which will encompass also criminal things. And that when the war is over, these things are likely to stay. I mean, that makes sense to me, but it is still an assumption. And even some of the cases that you may, or this one case of the boy who was forging documents and who 18 years later was still in that business. This is very interesting, and it would seem to be giving support to your argument, but there's a sense in which it is also anecdotal, right? And so I think you try to deal with this difficulty by making the suggestion that there was a larger context in the post-war period within which operated in such a way that actually required those skills to be deployed in order for people to continue surviving. Now, I think the questions that I would need to clarify here, or I would like to ask you to elaborate on, was, I mean, first, a general and perhaps unfair question is, you know, do we know of cases in the world where survival strategies where, you know, then, you know, continue to exist as part of criminal life? I don't know. And, you know, the immediate reason why I asked that question, which is a bit unfair, is because, you know, I come from a country that also went through a war experience. So I'm from Mozambique. And during that war, people resorted to all sorts of things. But I do not think that a form of crime developed in Mozambique which could be equated with what we have in Nigeria. So the link between the war and crime afterwards seems to me to be, you know, to be in need of more elaboration, right? And so one way of doing that is, for example, to check up other cases of war and see what happened in those other cases, and then rule those factors out in some way, to come back to Biafra and Nigeria and actually say, look, this was the crucial thing in Nigeria. Now, the second question is whether the crucial thing itself will be found in the Biafra war or in the Nigerian circumstances, because as we know, I mean, Nigeria was one of the most politically unstable countries in Africa after independence, right? With all, you know, with that succession of coup d'etats and murders and so on. So, you know, there's something very Nigerian about the story that you are telling, right? Which, you know, might require attention to be paid to, yeah, well, to that specificity. And of course, you can still say, well, you know, Nigeria had Biafra, it had that war. So that war actually explains the special circumstances of Nigeria. I'm not sure whether that will work well, but I would be interested in actually understanding that better. So the third question is really one about, you know, it's about time, really. You know, how we, you know, how we explain outcomes. Right? So how historians explain outcomes. If, you know, sociologists use social mechanisms, right? So, you know, we would try to identify some kind of social mechanism that ensured that, I don't know, you know, that crime continued afterwards. So, for example, in sociology, one social mechanism that we can identify is the creation of gang culture, right? So if you could show that Biafrans who were in the business of forgery and so on afterwards created gangs, and through that they somehow established themselves within Nigerian post-war society, and then they developed within that context. Similar processes like you have in the U.S. or you had in the U.S. with the mafia, with the Italian mafia, with the Irish mafia, and so we use such social mechanisms to account for outcomes, right, over time, right? So that's as far as the first claim that you are making in the book is concerned, which like I say, I really find it compelling, and I'm still to decide whether I find it convincing, right? But probably you have more detail in the book, of course. The second issue, and with that I'll be done, is this really very interesting suggestion that you are making for us to take a fresher look, another look at the relationship between the post-colonial state in Africa and the rule of law. That's really a great question, and I found everything that you said about this really interesting, because these are things I wasn't aware of. I wasn't aware of the fact that during this Biafra issue, that element of law played such an important role. But here again, the questions are more or less of the same nature. So the first question is, would we be able to say the same thing about other conflict situations in Africa? And I'm not sure about that, so if we look at more recent cases like Sierra Leone, Liberia, and so on, I mean, we don't find any semblance of the rule of law in those contexts. What to me might point to something that's very specific to Biafra and to Nigeria and to the period itself, right? And there's a figure you mentioned, especially in the introductory chapter, and you mentioned him here, Mbanefo. And I'm just wondering, I don't know much about him and about the whole story, but I'm just wondering to what extent his own personality and his commitment to law and to his identity as a lawmaker, to what extent that played a role in the extent to which legality was observed. And in the introduction, you also write about how frustrated he became by the way people were lying to him and so on. But I'm just wondering really if part of this story is not related to the personality of this man, right? There may be other factors that are specific to Biafra, but the one that comes to mind, as far as I'm concerned, is this one person here. So that would be also, the one question that I would want to ask you to explore a bit in this connection. And then, of course, well, I mean, we can. That would be very difficult and problematic, perhaps. But it's this whole thing about how British colonial rule placed emphasis on legality and so on. and you know, the kind of impact that had on colonial subjects. I mean, this, you know, we see the legal establishment in former British colonies, you know, how much they mirror, you know, British courts and so on, with their wigs and everything. So to what extent, you know, there's an element of a British culture in what you are observing here, in ways that you would not find in former Portuguese colonies or French colonies. I mean, this would be my immediate comments to your fascinating story here, and really, I want to congratulate you on this on this book. It's really very interesting, fascinating what you're telling us here. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, if you want to answer, Dr. Daly, yeah.
Would you prefer I answer now, or should I wait till?
Now it's perfect, and then we will.
Okay, great. Thank you for those extremely rich comments, which I think I probably won't be able to answer all of them, but just to give a few thoughts on the back of what you said. I do think the comparative angle is very important here. And indeed, it is not in every conflict in Africa, let alone the world, where this kind of alloy of crime that emerges on the battlefield lasts into the post-war period. And I think actually some of the most compelling examples of places where it does are not located in Africa. They're located elsewhere. I think often of the American Civil War, for example, where the remnants of Confederate militias like the Bushwhackers in Arkansas and Missouri reinvented themselves as criminal gangs in the American West after the American Civil War. Or similarly, you could look to Southeastern Europe after the Balkan Wars and the emergence of international syndicates that stretched far beyond the region of the war zone, but nonetheless made use of skills that people had developed there. So it is these examples that I think are probably most compelling, rather than ones in Africa. And to start to answer your second, or respond to your second question as well, you know, I think a lot about Ghana as well, a country that is structurally very similar to Nigeria in many respects, that shares a lot of its and a fair amount of its post-colonial experience as well, in terms of the tumult of the first years of independence, period of military administration. And yet Ghana did not experience something like 419, and Nigeria did. And I think a big point of differentiation between those two countries, for example, is the war, as you alluded to. It is hard for me to make this argument in a way that I think will be satisfying to social scientists. I am not one at all. I think of myself more as a storyteller than anything else, which also I should note, you know, you're right that these are very anecdotal pieces of evidence, and something like the story of Arnold Akpan, although it's not the only piece of evidence, it's, you know, it's not one that is scalable. It's not as if I have a rich quantitative archive that I can draw upon to make this point. And in fact, because the archives that I work with are so piecemeal, there is no single town or court for which I have anything like a complete record from this period. My approach to these cases is sort of narrative. It is to look at them as stories of how individual people respond to these situations of warfare, but not necessarily to scale them up in a social scientific sense. So I wish I could do that, but I have neither the skills nor the records to do it. I'm kind of going all over the place here. I apologize for not responding to your comments in a straightforward manner, but the question about other factors in Nigeria that would have, that one might use to explain crime, the proliferation of political murders in the first years of the First Republic, the complicated way that independence had been achieved. I absolutely agree with all these as important things in Nigeria's history. And I do not deny the existence of other factors that fed into the emergence of 419 and its related forms of crime. I think that a fuller story of this episode would include things like the colonial period, which is the subject of Stephen Pierce's work, for example. It would include the workings of the oil economy, as in the work of Apter. It would also include sort of dynamics that are internal to Nigeria's political culture, which is the focus of scholars like Wale Adebanwi, Ebenezer Obadare, or Pius Adesanju. I think that all of those things are very important, and I do not deny their existence in this story. But I think that the Civil War was the spark that catalyzed a larger reaction between these elements. So it did not create them, but it kind of made them express themselves as crime, in effect. As for the social mechanism at work here, I think actually what is most surprising about this history from a criminological perspective is the absence of a mechanism. At the end of the book, I have a little sort of polemic section in which I argue that organized crime in Nigeria is mostly spectral. It is mostly chimera. And the criminal organizations that are thought to organize 419 and other criminal activities, as soon as you scratch beneath the surface, they don't really prove to exist in any meaningful way. And I think a more accurate description of what drives crime in Nigeria is ordinary people making everyday decisions about how to get by. They are not commanded by a godfather. There is not a big underlying structure in the form of a mafia or Cosa Nostra or something like that. This is harder to grapple with using social scientific tools, but I think it is more accurate to say that it is something that ordinary people do of their own volition, rather than something that is commanded by a structure. Similarly, you could look in vain here for a profile of who was engaged in crime in Nigeria in the 1970s. It was not the preserve of any one ethnic group. It was not the preserve of any one class. We find petty criminals with university degrees and market women who seemingly were illiterate but found ways to stage elaborate, fraudulent criminal acts. It was neither the preserve of men or women. There were women who engaged in armed robbery as well, which was very surprising to Nigerian judges who thought that women were incapable of that kind of crime. Crime in the 1960s and 70s broke all of the tools that jurists, judges, and criminologists had to understand who engaged in crime and why. And I don't really have an explanation for that, but I think it's worth noting that it did kind of break those tools. And finally, and I know I'm going on a long time, I apologize, on the judicial culture here, Mbanefo was one of many judges like him who had been trained in the late colonial period in the British Isles and had come back to Nigeria in the late colonial period and become judges. They were very committed to the English common law tradition that they had inherited from Britain, in this case by way of Nigeria, and they had a lot of faith in that system. In the context of Biafra, the conditions of the war very quickly made it clear that that system was not going to work very well on the battlefield. And so judges like Mbanefo had to deal with the fact that they also presided over the expansion of martial law, institutions like the Special Tribunal that I mentioned in my presentation, and they witnessed the kind of what they saw as the hollowing out of the English common law tradition. And this was very disenchanting to them. Nonetheless, even throughout this very chaotic and grim period, they remained committed to the law, and the people who their courts served, ordinary civilians and also soldiers, continued to make recourse to law, even in the darkest days of the war. And I think this reveals something important about proceduralism and law in post-colonial Africa. Legalism often is the state. And this flies in the face of the apparent thinness of African post-colonial states in this period. Okay, I'll leave it there. There are a million other things that I could say, but I know we're running short on time. Thank you for that very rich response.
Thanks so much for the comments and also for the answer. So now we will listen to the commentary of Dr. Lasse Hertien.
Hi everyone. Many thanks to Sophie for inviting me and for organizing this splendid online seminar. My apologies, I cannot present my comment live. I regret very, very much that I cannot partake in the discussion, but I hope the pre-recorded comment will also make a helpful contribution to the latter. Let me state up front, Sam's book, his History of the Republic of Biafra, is an outstanding work, a marvelous achievement. I'm thankful that I could read part of the book already in advance, and I'm flattered, and I have to admit, also a bit humbled, to be invited to add my comments to this work. I will proceed by briefly outlining Sam's work, outline what I think Sam is doing, and then ask a set of questions. Sam does a remarkable job in presenting a number of fresh perspectives on and comparing insights into a subject that, especially in the last 3 years, has become a substantially debated subject matter for historians in many fields, most prominently the burgeoning historiographies of human rights and humanitarianism, both of them particularly productive fields of research connected to a wider embrace of global, transnational, cultural, historical perspectives on domains that international and diplomatic historians have dealt with for a while. While many works deal with Biafra and Nigeria during the Civil War, and indeed post-colonial Africa more generally, from international starting points, and are based on archives that relate more to what may be called Africa in the world than African history in Africa, Sam found ways to write a fascinating history of Biafran society. Something that most of us have, apart from some works based on oral history, mostly relied on literature, notably Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's South of a Yellow Sun. Based on painstaking research in archives in Nigeria, and indeed across the globe too, Sam, however, has been able to zoom closely into the social worlds of war-ridden Biafra, a world that has many traces in contemporary news and diplomatic reports, in literature and memoirs, but next to no archival records from within the state about the domestic situation. And this absence of archival records is not least due to a willful act of erasure at the end of the war, when the administrators of defeated Biafra destroyed documents to erase the traces of wartime actions that federal authorities might use against them, or at least they feared so. Yet the history that Sam presents is not only about Biafra, but by way of delving deeply into the case's specifics, Sam is able to say something about not only his case, but more generally about war and society, about law and society. He's more interested in the human condition, if you will, than the African condition, whatever that is. Sam zooms in closely, and that allows him to arrive at results that can then be generalized and discussed in a more general framework. But he also presents a specific story about Nigerian scamming, about crime in Nigeria, Nigeria's global reputation for fraud, the famous 419 scams, and armed robberies. Sam asks, were these results of the wartime experience, legacies not merely of a colonial past, as many of us would probably assume, but of the Biafran War? Sam's work presents fascinating lines of inquiry based on impressive research, archival research and interviews. It is compellingly argued and admirably written. Hence, my only major criticism is that Sam did not already write this book, say, a decade earlier. Because I would indeed love to have been able to draw on this work when I was trying to understand what was happening in Biafra and Nigeria during the war, even though my own research was on the international and global plane, but I felt that this is something that really somebody needed to tackle. from a scholar who presented such a major work as his first book. But as to comment on his book, I tried long and hard to come up with a set of questions that might help to put his work into what I hope are interesting and fresh perspectives. And these questions pertain to three perspectives, I'd say. The first is about comparisons about societies at war and post-war societies. The second question is about post-war societies and the relationship to post-secession, whether this is actually more post-war story or post-secession story. And the third, and in good climactic organization, I think this is my main question actually. The third question is about whether this was a post-war, is a story about war and the post-war, or whether this actually still to a large degree a post-colonial history after all. Let me come to my first point about comparisons on societies at war. I was wondering, Sam, whether you saw any similar developments in other African post-colonies after war. As far as I can see, this is a very Nigerian story. Say Angola, Liberia, or Ivory Coast did not produce similar forms of crime after the respective wars there. But also beyond Africa, wars frequently the setting of organized smuggling, for instance, and of course, the setting for myriad ways in which people take on new identities to get past controls, for instance, or to obscure past roles as collaborators and informants when occupiers leave, or to obscure past roles played in defeated political systems when new authorities install their rule. As a historian of Europe and the world, and indeed a historian from Europe, the Nazi Empire or Vichy France and both of their demise come to mind, but the examples are of course myriad. How then is Sam's story a particularly Nigerian story, and what aspects of it are part of a more universal story? These are of course questions that Sam already writes about, but I wanted to ask him to say maybe a bit more about this. The second question is whether this is not merely a post-war, but very much also a secessionist story and a post-secessionist story. How much is this maybe not only Nigerian, but specifically Biafran? That means not only a post-war story, but a post-secessionist one. The outline that, quote, misconduct during and after the war ignored ethnicity, class, and gender, unquote. But can you say more possibly about region? I would usually imagine 419 scammers sitting in a Lagos internet cafe, but maybe these practices are actually more widespread in what may be called post-Biafra than other parts of Nigeria. I simply don't know, but I was wondering whether this is a line of thought that could be followed to some degree, even though I have to admit that these legacies and continuities are difficult to trace. And the model that I'm suggesting here would actually be too simplistic to capture the nuance. But still, connected with this and the previous point about comparisons, do you maybe see similar legacies in other post-secession societies? You briefly mentioned Congo and Katanga, but how about other examples? A prominent example would, of course, be the American South. There's a footnote about antebellum militarism, but maybe you can also say something whether you've seen something that may be worth comparing in the American South after the Civil War. My third, and I think most important question is about the role of the colonial past, of anti-colonialism and decolonization as a part of this history that Sam presents. He ably and indeed convincingly shows that this is a history about war, the effect of war on society, even beyond the end of the war, lingering on into a long post-war history that continues for decades, probably even into the present. And I also agree with this effort to write against the widespread tendency to parochialize Africa. But at the think that there are possible lines of inquiry that might serve to highlight the nevertheless significant role that the colonial past played in the story. And here I would like to make two related points, which are both tied to this larger question about the colonial past. And both of these points are about forging documents as performances of new identities and the ideas about transforming identities. I was extremely intrigued by, and I really like this idea, so I don't want to be too critical about it because I found it very compelling. So this idea and this argument that Biafra is a state that merely, in the end, proclaimed to be one, but never really became a state, posing as a state, but lacking some of the necessary of its necessary qualities, in particular recognition, of course. This empire, this dream empire, Ojukwu's dream empire, as Nigerian publicity portrayed it, with its roving emissaries that diplomats described as imposed ambassadors, whether this Biafran quasi-state was mirrored by the practices of identity fraud that were so widespread among its citizens, that this is connected in history. Biafra posing as a state and Biafrans posing or taking on new identities. And I'd like to agree that a lot of this story is specifically about Biafra as a diplomatic revolution that failed, but also enabled the imagination and factual forging of new identities, also even down to an individual level. Yet, I think that there might be more to be said about the colonial past and experience in this story. And there are 2 points that I want to make here. And the first is about colonial discourse and how the transformation of identity, how personal transformation was at the core of colonial discourses. Because I was wondering how much this indeed very characteristically Biafran rhetoric of not only making a new Biafran state, but also making new Black African men, and how far this rhetoric was not also tied to a longer history of colonialism. From the civilizing mission to modernization theory, colonial discourse presented visions of making modern men, or civilized men, perfected natives. And this was a highly gendered language, so it was indeed primarily about making modern men. So I was wondering whether, in this way, these Biafran imaginations and practices of taking on, of performing, of forging new identities, also through forging documents, passports and the like, whether this was also part of a specifically colonial discursive framing. Because is this not the purported core, or was this not the purported core of the colonial vision, a vision of social transformation? And my second point related to this larger question about the colonial past is about the history of intercolonialism and connection to forms of policing, of international diplomacy and espionage, actually, too. The transnational and global networks of anti-colonial movements have been formed in a dialectical relationship with the forming transnational networks and practices of policing, of international police work, and of diplomacy. As Daniel Brückenhaus has argued, international and inter-imperial diplomatic and police cooperation have also impacted on anti-colonial activists who needed to navigate trans-imperial in-between spaces to elude the control of imperial authorities. This started in the colonies, but then was taken place to a large degree in the metropoles. And this indeed included assuming alliances and forging identities. Taking this model one step further, Michael Goebel has shown that the relationship between anti-colonial activists and imperial authorities was even closer in the anti-imperial metropolis Paris, where some notable anti-colonial activists also worked as spies for the French Empire. So they were using sets, a number of different identities. They assumed different names all the time. They were really used to that. And regardless of whether later Biafrans may have worked as spies for the British Empire, at least I'm not aware of any research that shows or even only suggests such. These cat-and-mouse games played by anti-colonial activists and international police and diplomatic services entailed the forging of documents, of passports, of taking on new names, new identities, changing their names all the time, taking on pen names under which they wrote anti-colonial pamphlets. They went on covert missions, etc. It's also related to this larger complex of translation, of translating the names into different languages. Maybe this was also a history that prefigured the practices of many later Biafrans. We know that many significant figures in the Biafran leadership and establishment had a background in the anti-colonial movement. Sam writes a bit about the mobility of many people who ended up in the Biafran leadership and in the Biafran establishment. So they were used to using passports and the like, but they were not only used to using documents, but maybe also to using different names. So I'm wondering whether this was also significant in this regard, and maybe hence whether their practices tell us not only a story about Biafra as a society at war, but indeed tell us as much a story defined by the paths of colonialism, anti-colonialism, and decolonization.
Thank you very much to Dr. Heerton for that response, which is also extremely rich. I'm going to be very brief in responding to it in the interest of time, and also because some of it overlaps with Professor Makama's intervention. I've mostly emphasized the ways in which Biafra is distinct in the historiography of warfare in Africa. But indeed, there are ways in which it is not. And there are also ways in which the history of colonialism that Dr. Heerton discusses, is inseparable from this history. One aspect of that would be the role of bureaucracy in colonial Nigeria and the imbrication of Eastern Nigerians, especially in bureaucratic structures. Eastern Nigerians, and especially Igbos, had lived throughout the Nigerian Federation as a kind of internal diaspora of traders and administrators, bureaucrats. And in the course of their life in those, in the service of the state and in regions of Nigeria that they were not from, they had learned to appreciate the protective capacity of documents. And I think that explains quite a lot about why passes and other forms of documentation became so fetishized in Biafra. That's just an example of the kind of thing that Lasse is alluding to here. The question about spies is very interesting, and I hadn't thought of that until he brought it up. I actually rely pretty heavily on the testimony of spies, but they are not Biafran spies informing to the British Empire, but rather they are spies for the South African government, the British government, the French government, the Irish government, all of which were involved in the conflict in various ways. And there is something, I think, about there is something to the fact that the cloak and dagger kind of intrigue of spying in wartime can spill over into fraud once the war is over, which is consistent with the larger argument that I was making in my presentation. There's more to say on that, but again, I'm going to be brief. The imitative quality of the Biafran government in terms of its diplomatic history and the way that it presented itself, I think that is relevant, again, not only for Africa, but more broadly. And I think that the Biafran government's attempt to present itself as legitimate to the international community through the issuing of documents, through emphasizing the coherence of its legal system, which it did regularly, through its kind of semi-fraudulent diplomats who Lasse had mentioned, all of that points to a broader truth about nation states in general, which is that all of them are synthetic, all of them are imitative or performative. And it is only ones that fail, like Biafra, that come to be seen as unreal or as fraudulent. Biafra is not to Nigeria as a fake country is to a real one, but as one fake is to another. And I think if there is a larger takeaway for the study of the nation state that emerges from that book, this book, it is that. I'm going to write to Laza because I have not done justice to his comments, but since we're almost out of time, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I am speaking from Geneva. I am from the place that used to be Biafra. I'm from Nigeria, Biafra, place that used to be called Biafra land. So it's actually an interesting presentation, and I was wondering how you were able, first of all, I was wondering how you were able to gather most of the resources that you use for your writings, because writing about topics related to Biafran war is a very sensitive issue in Nigeria. I mean, because of the issue of the Biafran war, the Nigerian government has banished teaching of history in Nigeria because there was this thought that it might bring up several tension amongst the ethnic group. So it's quite interesting that you've written that it's going to be an addition to our history collections because we don't have many at hand. So I have several questions to ask. I would have, it's appear, I mean, based on the first, the first commented, the person that commented first and the second, it appeared that most of what I could see, of course, I've not read the whole of the book. I've not had access to it. So based on your explanation, I'm going to rely on your presentation. It appeared that you're making, for me, a very big claim. I mean, the conclusion, I mean, trying to connect the crime, trying to predict that there was a trend from the crime that was committed within the Biafran war and after the Biafran war. That connection, I was thinking, is a very big claim or conclusion that might require very comprehensive research. And I was also wondering, I mean, the two cases that you mentioned, the one in Udi and the one in Onitsha, happen to be cities within the Biafra territory. I was wondering if you were, I mean, the former Biafra territory. I was wondering if you were able to also come up with cases that happened outside the former Biafra territory to see whether there was any influence from the Biafran territory, or there was any connection, any relationship between the crimes that was committed during the Biafran war or post-Biafra and the former Biafran territory and outside the Biafran territory, to see if there's any correlation with that. And the secondly, finally, my last comment would be that, like I mentioned before, it's quite a very big claim, which like I said, I've not read the book, so I wouldn't know whether you have sufficient evidence to support that. But recently, actually, quite recently in the Nigerian Twitter field, there were actually currently, since yesterday, an interesting interaction, people trying to discuss what has led to the current Nigerian situation with regards to corruption, crimes, and all these things happening in Nigeria. I mean, since yesterday, there has been over 100,000 reactions to this kind of discussion from Nigeria all over the world. And the most important takeaway of the discussion going on now, many people are of the opinion that the current problem, crime, corruption situation in Nigeria could be traced to the leadership of Nigeria of 1985. They actually mentioned there were instances of crime during the war or during the colonial era, but many people of the opinion that the leadership of 1985 actually caused very many disservice to the value, and they actually led to the frequency of the crime and the fraud system that we have in Nigeria. Incidentally, it was also the same government that defined the fraud in Nigeria as 419, that we call it, as we call frauds now. And it's like I said, there are very many discussions around the issue of the origin about crime and the corruption in Nigeria. So thank you for the interesting presentation. And like I said, it's going to be a very rich addition to history of Biafra in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you. Should I respond, or do you want to collect a couple?
No, you can respond, and then I will
okay.
a question of Professor Meyer. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great. Absolutely. So this is a controversial topic in Nigeria today. Generally speaking, I actually found that archives were fairly open to me. Most of them come from small, fairly little used legal libraries and registrars, the sort of storerooms of courts in the former Biafra. And these are working archives that are intended for the use of lawyers. And very few people, if anyone, has ever asked to see these Biafran documents. And so in most cases, I was kind of greeted with a certain degree of surprise, but also a lot of openness. I think that some of the most rich materials came from the National War Museum in Umuahia, which has a small collection that I'm not exactly sure how it ended up there, but a very rich collection of documents from Biafra itself that I was also allowed to use. Many of the interviewees that I spoke to were very keen to talk about their wartime experience, which I offer some reasons in the book for why I think that might be. But generally speaking, most people were pretty happy to talk about the war. And as you know, the war has reemerged as a topic of political agitation in Nigeria today. And there is a new Biafran movement that is very distinct from the one that took place in the 1960s, but that has brought Biafra back into the news. And so perhaps this accounts for why people are very willing to talk about it today in a way that they might not have before. In terms of the question about how to trace these forms of crime from Biafra out into the rest of reintegrated Nigeria, this is a very important question. And you'll have to go to the book to see whether you are convinced by my interpretation of the documents. But generally speaking, in the 1970s, the forms of crime that had become endemic, had become major problems in Biafra, spread out into the rest of reintegrated Nigeria. Armed robbery is the one that is easiest to trace, but fraud as well became something that was practiced the length and width of the Nigerian Federation. And there's a good story that I think is probably apocryphal, but nonetheless illustrates part of what I'm trying to get at. Many people believed that guns that were used in armed robberies in northern Nigeria and elsewhere in the 1970s and 80s, if they were encrusted with red dirt, that meant that they came from the former Biafra, where they had been buried by ex-combatants and later dug up to be used in crimes in the rest of the Federation. There's no way of knowing if this was actually really the case, but it suggests something about the way that crime was perceived. And I think there was probably some truth to the fact that armaments, at the very least, from Biafra were used to conduct armed robberies. Indeed, the Babangida, Abacha, and other regimes of the 1980s and 90s are very intimately tied to the proliferation of crime in Nigeria, and I don't deny that. But I would say that crime did not emerge under IBB and Abacha from nowhere, that it came from somewhere, and the somewhere where it came from was in large part the Civil War and its aftermath. 419, I think this is quite interesting. 419 first emerges as a noun, as a kind of slang word for this body of criminal activities and corruption not in the 1980s, which is what I thought it was as well, but actually in the immediate aftermath of the war. And the first usages that you can find of it being used as a kind of noun are in like 1970, 1971. So it's a slightly but critically older phenomenon in Nigerian politics. But thank you for those questions.
Thanks so much. So Professor Mayer, yeah. I cannot hear you.
Okay, first let me
Hi.
say I think the presentation and the critique, especially the critique that could be made in person, were really first rate and interesting. And my question is somewhat, I think, similar to the last one. In other words, what is the specific, what is happening to crime in non-Biafran Nigeria during the war? How do we, how do we know this? Or would you say you want to make a specific for Biafra that would not be the rest of the Federation? I think this is the major one. And are there types of crime that you have crimes of violence, those involving guns? You have corruption, which you haven't dealt with, but which we've seen, is constantly, at least in the American press, when it speaks about Africa and Nigeria. And then you have these fraudulent forgeries, and I don't know, they're very specific sorts of crime, and I wonder whether you might differentiate with a sort of finer comb which legacy comes from where. Thank you, though. I enjoyed this both, and both comment and paper. I look forward to the book.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So to answer the first question, during the war itself in federal Nigeria, which is to say non-Biafra Nigeria, the sources that I have at my disposal indicate that crime was really not a problem. It was not something that was experienced widely. And the few sociologists who studied crime during this period, most notably Tekena Tamuno, who was actually also a historian but was very involved in criminological research, argued that crime had actually declined in federal Nigeria during the war. And the explanation that he offered for this was that all of the young men who might be, the sort of criminally disposed class in other circumstances were off fighting war and not at home creating havoc or, engaging in armed robberies or that kind of thing. I'm not sure how much I fully believe that account for reasons mostly methodological, but I think it's quite clear that the forms of crime that emerged in the 1970s were distinct from what had happened before. So these included things like armed robberies conducted with military surplus, for example. Although guns were certainly not unheard of or unknown in Nigeria prior to the war, automatic and semi-automatic weapons were a new phenomenon, and they changed the way that crime could be conducted. And they also made it more terrifying and more likely to end in death or grievous bodily harm. So I can't be so I can't be so confident about any of the criminological statistics that I have at my disposal, but there is a qualitative difference between the forms of crime that happened in Nigeria from the 1970s onwards and those that came before. Your second question, right, about corruption. So it's very difficult to disaggregate corruption as it takes place in the Nigerian body politic from the forms of fraud that I am interested in, which are mostly forms of crime that citizens conduct against one another rather than against the state or the state against citizens. I don't feel like I can answer that question very well, but I would point you to the work of Stephen Pierce and his book Moral Economies of Corruption, which is an extremely convincing and very detailed picture of exactly that relationship between corruption in the state and the kinds of crime that might be represented by like a forgery case or an internet scam or that kind of thing. That's a bit of a cop-out, but that's my honest answer. Let's look to somebody else's work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me just say personally, long ago as a member of your faculty and department, it was a nice period of time.
Oh, lovely. Good. It's a nice place.
Yeah, great.
We have still one question of Tatiana Reno, who was a PhD candidate at Luxembourg, if I'm right. And so she asked in the conversation, and also Yehor, okay, so I will take the two questions. So she was asking, following on Professor Macomo's question on the legacy of the colonial British Empire, did you identify the use of standards of proof by the Biafran courts? Then Yehor, if you can just ask your question also very briefly. Yeah.
So hello, my name is Igor. I'm a PhD candidate from Ukraine, and in Ukraine we started to analyze world history from post-colonial methodology, from global history approach. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Daly, for very conceptual presentation, which is personally for me very fruitful for further discussions. I have a couple of questions to you. So the first question is, you have mentioned Chinua Achebe, one of the most famous African writers, so what was the intellectual response in Nigeria towards civil war? And the second question is, what is the current memory policy in Nigeria about that event? And the third question, very briefly, in Nigerian case, we speak about post-colonial post-colonial violation of human rights, the violation of the rule of law, and was the colonial period in some dimension some kind of safeguard from this civil disorder in Nigerian case? Thank you.
Okay, I will add two questions. No, what, just one question. So I really think that your book is really interesting, and the introduction and chapters 3 I read are really interesting, and it's really a deep work and a deep book. So I really, yeah, I'm looking forward to reading the whole book. So I see many parallels with, I'm working on Vietnam, and I was working on the French courtroom and the use of the implementation of law. And then I trace this, I have, in my last chapter, I have traces like forms of imitation from the Vietnamese state. And it's really interesting to see that sometimes the Vietnamese state is imitating the use of law by the French to legitimate their own power and to create like a form of nation building. And it's really interesting to see the maybe a transfer or an imitation, I don't know what is the right word, but I'm very interested in the place of the courtroom in the city. So was there any instrumentalization where were these courtrooms? Where is it, in military barracks or it is in huge buildings? So I'm really interested in the scenery of the courtrooms, because it's also say a lot about the legitimation process. So thank you very much again. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for those questions. So to begin with, Tatiana Reno's about the standards of proof, and this actually also speaks to your question that you just asked. Generally speaking, proceduralism dissimulated in Biafra over the course of the war. It became more and more irregular as the war chipped away at what remained of the Biafran Republic. Trials were interrupted by shellings. The investigations were made impossible to carry out because people couldn't reach the scenes of crimes, all those kinds of things. And so although proceduralism was extremely important to Biafra, in its self-expression, it's not as if this legal system worked well. It's not as if it worked smoothly. And, you know, the standards of proof kind of became irrelevant in these situations, in these circumstances. And the actual staging of trials also became very irregular. And as Biafran towns and villages were bombed and government buildings were destroyed and large populations of people moved within Biafra as refugees, all this meant that, you know, the actual trial was often very irregular. It was often convened outside. It was often, there were often no law books around for lawyers and judges to turn to make decisions. And there are actually, you know, cases that I found where the proceedings themselves are actually interrupted by an air raid. So you can imagine the kind of legal culture that that represents. It's not a particularly systematic one, even though it may be very important in the ideology and the working of the state. So, okay. In terms of the intellectual response to the war in Nigeria, generally speaking, Nigerian intellectuals who were not Biafrans opposed the Biafran secessionist movement. They opposed it on a number of different grounds, most commonly on the grounds that this was a step back in terms of African unification and Pan-Africanism, which of course was one of the kind of ideas on everyone's tongue in the 1960s. And Biafra secession appeared to be a step away from that goal rather than towards it. Now, one important exception to that would be Wole Soyinka, the Nigerian playwright, poet, man of all trades, who was fairly sympathetic to the Biafran cause and was actually imprisoned for that. But generally speaking, the tide of public opinion in Nigeria was pretty solidly against Biafra, and that included among intellectuals. In terms of the question about human rights, I would not say that colonialism had been a kind of bulwark against authoritarianism, in fact, quite the opposite. However, some judges, including those like Mbanefo, found some use in the common law tradition as a way to safeguard against authoritarianism. And they really believed that law could be used to ensure that despotism didn't happen. This topic is more germane for the period after the war and for Nigeria's long period of military administration. But suffice it to say that law in these circumstances, like in most, was a double-edged sword. And so although in some circumstances, the legal tradition that Nigeria had inherited from colonialism could in fact be used to safeguard rights and to prevent despotism or authoritarianism, it could just as easily be turned to despotic or authoritarian purposes. And of course, that is a characteristic of law in many places.